The wagon wheel groaned, a sound that had become the metronome of Ruthie's new life. It was a 2-beat rhythm, a high, splintering creak as the wood strained, followed by a low, solid thump as it met the rutted earth. Creak, thump, creak, thump. For 6 days, that sound had been her only constant companion, more faithful than the family who had put her on this relentless, westward-crawling machine. The cold of the late Missouri October bit through her thin wool shawl, a damp, persistent chill that seemed to emanate from the very soil and seep into her bones. The sky was the color of dishwater, a vast, indifferent canvas of gray that offered no promise of sun, no hint of warmth. The fields, stripped of their summer bounty, stretched out on either side, brown and skeletal under the oppressive sky. It was a landscape of endings, a world already turning its face toward the long death of winter. Ruthie pulled the shawl tighter, her knuckles white. The fabric was coarse, dyed a practical, joyless brown, but it was all she had against the wind that swept unimpeded across the plains. In her lap, her hands rested protectively over the slight but undeniable swell of her belly. Beneath the layers of her dress and petticoat, she could feel the faint, fluttering life that had sealed her fate. The laughter of her brothers was a ghost that rode with her, more chilling than the wind. It hadn't been loud, boisterous laughter. It had been something far worse, a low, snickering thing, shared between them over clasped hands and knowing glances as they'd loaded her small, pathetic trunk onto the wagon. "Make sure you write, little sister," Caleb had said, his voice thick with a mock sincerity that was sharper than any blade. "Tell us all about the wonders of the Montana Territory, and about your husband." Horace, the younger of the two, had just grinned, a cruel twist of his lips. A man of God, no less. He'll pray the sin right out of you, I reckon. Their words echoed the pronouncement her father had made 2 weeks prior, in the suffocating silence of the parlor. He had not looked at her. Not once. His eyes, cold and hard as river stones, had been fixed on the fireplace, as if the flames held more interest than the daughter who had brought shame upon his house. He'd held a newspaper clipping in his hand, pinched between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something soiled. A man in the Bitterroot Valley, a Mr. Matthew Thorne. He has a piece of land, traps for a living. He has advertised for a wife, a God-fearing woman of good character to help build a home. He'd paused, the silence stretching until it was thin and brittle. Your sister Eleanor was to answer. She is a woman of good character. The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Eleanor, with her golden hair, her clear blue eyes, and her untarnished reputation, was the one worthy of such a match. But Eleanor was to be wed to the banker's son in Springfield. A proper match, a respectable match. This was something else. "We have already sent a letter," her father had continued, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "It will arrive before you do. We have explained the situation, that Eleanor is unavailable, but that her younger sister is prepared to take her place. We vouched for your strength and your ability to work. Work, that was what she was good for. Ruthie, with her plain face, her quiet demeanor, and her hair the color of dusty straw. She was the sturdy one, the one who could milk the cows before dawn and scrub the floors until her hands were raw. She was the shadow that followed the bright light of her sister, and now she was the vessel of the family's shame, to be shipped west like unwanted cargo. The cruelest part of the joke was the advertisement itself, a promise of a life that was now a sentence of exile. They hadn't sent the letter to Mr. Thorne to find her a haven. They'd sent it to be rid of her. A jolt of the wagon shook her from the memory. She pressed a hand to her side, her fingers instinctively seeking the 2 small objects tucked into a pocket sewn on the inside of her dress. Her thumb traced the familiar, worn edges of her mother's Bible, the leather cover softened by years of devotion. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, its pages filled with her mother's spidery, faded script in the margins. It was the only part of her mother she had left. Inside the cover, tucked into a small fold, was a simple cross, fashioned from two bent pieces of tin and bound with wire. It was cold to the touch, a stark, humble piece of faith. The Bible and the cross, that was the entirety of her inheritance, the only dowry she brought to this strange, unknown union. The wagon driver, a man named Silas, cleared his throat. He was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and wind, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue. He had barely spoken a dozen words to her since they'd left the outskirts of her hometown. He seemed to prefer the company of his mules, murmuring to them in a low, soothing cadence that he never used with her. He reached back without turning his head, offering a dented tin canteen, water, Miss. "Thank you, Mr. Silas," she murmured, her voice raspy from disuse. Her throat was a desert. She took a small sip, the water tasting metallic and cold. It was a simple, necessary kindness, and for that reason, it felt monumental. Later, as the light began to fade from the gray sky, he wordlessly handed her a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried, salted meat. She ate slowly, methodically, making the meager meal last. It was sustenance, nothing more, but it was also a tether to the world. It was a reminder that she was still a living, breathing thing, not just a ghost being hauled across the prairie. This small gesture from a silent old man was the first seed of kindness she had received since her mother had passed 3 years ago. It was a tiny, fragile sprout in the frozen soil of her heart. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer. It was the same prayer she had whispered every night in the dark, suffocating space under the wagon's canvas cover, the same one she had prayed in the cold darkness of her bedroom after her father's decree. It was not a grand or eloquent prayer. It was a single, desperate plea, honed to its essential core. "Lord, please let me find a kind man." She did not pray for love. That was a foolish, girlish notion she had discarded long ago. She did not pray for wealth or comfort. She prayed only for kindness. A man who would not look at her with contempt. A man whose hands would be for building and helping, not for hurting. A man whose voice would not be a weapon. That was all. A sliver of human decency in the vast, intimidating wilderness that awaited her. It felt like asking for a mountain of gold. Creak, thump, creak, thump. The rhythm was a hammer, beating against her pride, flattening her sense of self until it was thin and transparent. With every mile that fell away behind them, Missouri became more of a dream. Her old life a story that had happened to someone else. She was being unmade and remade with every turn of the wheel. A sudden, distinct pressure from within made her gasp, a little flutter, like a trapped bird beating its wings against her ribs. The baby. It was the first time the movement had been so strong, so definite. A wave of mingled terror and something else, something fierce and protective surged through her. This child, the source of her ruin, was also an undeniable part of her. It was a life inextricably bound to her own. Her hand trembled as she laid it flat against her stomach. This was not just her journey. It was theirs. The fear was a cold knot in her gut. A fear for a child born into shame, destined for a life on the fringes with a mother nobody wanted. But alongside the fear, there was a stubborn, primal will to live. Not just for herself, but for the tiny, insistent life she carried. She had to survive. For the baby. The days bled into one another, a monotonous smear of gray skies and brown earth. Silas pointed to a herd of buffalo in the distance one afternoon, a dark, moving river on the horizon, and she watched until they were specks of dust. He pointed out the Platte River when they crossed it, its shallow, braided waters a silver ribbon in the muted landscape. Each was a landmark on her journey into oblivion. Then, on the 10th day, the world began to change. The flatness that had defined her existence for so long began to ripple. The earth swelled into low, rolling hills, then into higher, steeper bluffs. The air grew thinner, sharper, and then, one morning, as the sun struggled to burn through the ever-present layer of cloud, Silas pointed again, his gnarled finger aimed northwest. "There," he said, his voice raspy. "The mountains." Ruthie squinted, her eyes watering in the cold wind. At first, she saw nothing but the pale gray of the sky meeting the dark line of the horizon. But as she looked, truly looked, she saw it. A faint, jagged line of white, impossibly high, like a row of broken teeth chewing on the edge of the sky. It did not look real. It looked like a painting, a dream of a place that could not possibly exist in the same world as the muddy fields of Missouri. The Bitterroot Mountains. As the wagon crawled closer over the next 2 days, the mountains grew, rising from the earth to dominate the world. They were no longer a dreamy, ethereal line, but a massive, terrifying wall of stone and ice and dark, foreboding forest. They were magnificent and menacing, beautiful and brutal. This was her destination. This was her new life. A cold dread, heavier than any she had yet felt, settled deep in her soul. Somewhere in that wilderness, in a cabin nestled in a valley she could not imagine, a man was waiting. Mr. Matthew Thorne, a trapper, a man who had lived his life in the shadow of these giants, a man so isolated he had to put an advertisement in a newspaper to find a wife. The outline said he'd never even held a woman's hand. He was waiting for a letter to arrive, a letter promising him a respectable, virtuous, God-fearing woman named Eleanor. He was waiting for her beautiful sister. Instead, he was getting her. The wagon wheel gave a particularly loud groan, a sharp shriek of tormented wood. Far ahead, the white peaks of the mountains seemed to pierce the gray sky, silent and waiting, waiting for a joke to be delivered, waiting for a lie to arrive, waiting for a girl named Ruthie, whose only prayer was to find a single, kind man in all that vast, unforgiving wilderness. The town of Elk Crossing wasn't so much a town as a raw wound in the wilderness, a handful of log buildings huddled together against the immense, looming presence of the Bitterroot Range. It was a place that smelled of wet pine, coal smoke, and the metallic tang of impending snow. When Silas finally pulled his weary mules to a stop in front of the clapboard general store, the wind was a living thing, a razor that sliced across the muddy, half-frozen street, carrying with it the first hard flakes of winter. A small cluster of men, loafers and trappers waiting on supplies, had been gathered on the store's covered porch. The arrival of the freight wagon was a spectacle, a break in the crushing monotony of a long afternoon. They straightened up, their curiosity piqued, their eyes narrowed against the biting wind. A passenger. A woman. This was news. Silas, grunting with the effort, climbed down and came around to her side. "End of the line, miss." Ruthie gathered the worn wool shawl around her shoulders, her fingers stiff with cold. She took Silas's offered hand, her legs unsteady as she descended from the wagon perch. The moment her feet touched the ground, she felt the eyes of the men on the porch land on her like a physical weight. She stood for a moment, letting her body adjust to solid earth after weeks of ceaseless motion. And in that moment, as she straightened her back, the wind pressed the thin fabric of her dress against her body, revealing the undeniable truth of her condition. A low murmur rippled through the men. It started as a sound of surprise, then shifted, twisting into something ugly. One man nudged another, a grin spreading across his whiskered face. A low chuckle broke the silence. Then another, louder one joined it. Soon, a wave of coarse, open laughter rolled off the porch and washed over her. "Well, look what the freight brought in." The voice was loud, intended for all to hear. "Looks like she's carrying some extra cargo." "Must be looking for a miracle," another jeered, "or a mighty blind husband." The laughter swelled, a raw, cruel sound that echoed in the cold, thin air. Each laugh was a stone thrown at her, Ruthie felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, a heat that did nothing to warm the ice in her veins. Her first instinct was to shrink, to make herself small, to turn and hide behind the wagon. But then she felt the small, hard outline of her mother's Bible through the fabric of her dress. Her fingers found it, her hand closing around it like an anchor in a storm. She lifted her chin. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She would not cower. She stood straight, her gaze fixed on the distant, snow-shrouded peaks, pretending the men and their brutal laughter did not exist. She was a daughter of Missouri, and shame was a currency she understood. But she would not be bankrupted by it here, in the street of this strange, hostile town. The laughter began to falter, sputtering out as a new figure emerged from the shadows of the general store's doorway. He hadn't been a part of the jeering chorus on the porch. He moved with a quiet economy that made him seem larger than he already was. And he was a very large man. He was tall, with shoulders broad enough to block the light from the doorway. He wore a heavy, blanket-weight capote, the kind favored by men who lived more in the mountains than among them. His beard was thick and dark, and the cold had dusted it with frost, making it sparkle. But it was his eyes that commanded the space around him. They were the color of slate, deep-set and still, and they held a profound quietness, as if they had seen too many sunrises and snowstorms to be bothered by the small cruelties of men. He stepped off the porch, his worn leather boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He paid no mind to the other men, who now shuffled their feet and fell into an awkward silence. His gaze went directly to Ruthie, and it was a steady, unnerving thing. He wasn't looking at her swollen belly, the source of all the mockery. He was looking at her face, into her eyes, as if seeking to read the long, hard miles that had brought her here. He stopped a few feet in front of her. The wind whipped a strand of her pale hair across her face, and she felt a tremor of fear run through her. This had to be him, Matthew Thorne, the man her family had lied to, the man who was about to discover the full scope of the joke that had been played on him. She braced herself for the explosion of anger, for the public humiliation that would surely follow. But the anger never came. Instead, the big man slowly reached up and removed his fur-lined hat, holding it in his large, gloved hands. It was a simple gesture of respect, an old-world courtesy that was so unexpected it struck the crowd dumb. The silence in the street was now absolute, broken only by the howling of the wind. He looked straight at her, his stone-gray eyes holding hers. His voice, when he spoke, was low and calm, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. He spoke 7 simple words that landed with the force of a physical blow, silencing every last whisper of mockery. "Ma'am, let's get you inside." The world seemed to stop for a beat. The men on the porch stared, their mouths agape. A few of them had the decency to look ashamed, their face turning a dull red as they suddenly saw their own behavior reflected in his quiet dignity. They had acted like a pack of dogs, and he, with a few soft words, had reminded them they were men. Ruthie could only stare, bewildered. This was not the reaction she had prepared for. There was no anger, no accusation, only a simple, direct offer of shelter. She gave a small, jerky nod, unable to find her voice. He turned and gestured toward a sturdy buckboard wagon hitched nearby. A single, powerful-looking horse stood patiently in the traces, its breath pluming in the frigid air. "My wagon's just here," he said. He then walked to the back of Silas's freight wagon and, with an ease that bespoke immense strength, lifted her small, battered trunk and carried it to his own. He came back for her. "Allow me," he said, and before she could protest, he placed his hands on her waist to help her up onto the buckboard seat. His hands were huge, the leather of his gloves worn smooth. His touch was firm, steady, but there was an unfamiliar awkwardness to it, a careful hesitation. It was the touch of a man accustomed to handling axes and traps and the raw, untamed things of the wild, not the fragile shape of a woman. It was a touch that was immensely gentle, As he settled her onto the seat and wrapped a thick buffalo robe around her legs, she finally found her tongue. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. He simply nodded, then moved to the driver's seat and took up the reins. He didn't look at the crowd of silenced men. He didn't look back at Silas. With a soft click of his tongue, he set the horse into motion, and the buckboard lurched forward, pulling away from the general store and the staring faces, leaving the town of Elk Crossing behind. They traveled in silence for what felt like an eternity. The road was little more than a track, climbing steadily upward, away from the valley floor and into the deep shadows of the pines. The trees stood in solemn ranks, their branches heavy with a gathering weight of snow. The world grew quieter, the sounds of the town fading until all that was left was the creak of the wagon wheels, the soft thud of the horses' hooves on the snowy ground, and the ever-present sigh of the wind in the high branches. The lie sat in Ruthie's throat, a bitter, choking thing. Every moment that passed, every kindness he showed her, the warm robe, the steady presence beside her, made the deception worse. She could not let it go on. She could not arrive at his home, a liar and a fraud. He deserved the truth, no matter how ugly. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice small and tight. He turned his head slightly, his eyes still on the treacherous path ahead. "Yes, ma'am." "There's something you need to know. The letter my father sent, it wasn't the whole truth." He remained silent, his profile unreadable against the darkening woods. He just listened, giving her the space to say what had to be said. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sharp. "My sister, Eleanor, she was the one who was supposed to come. She's beautiful and good. They wrote to you about her." Her voice broke on a small sob. "They sent me instead, as a joke, because She couldn't say the word. She couldn't voice the shame. Instead, she put a hand on her belly. The child I'm carrying, I am not the woman you were expecting." She finished, her confession hanging in the frozen air between them. She waited for the inevitable, the anger, the disgust, for him to stop the wagon and order her out, leaving her on the side of this desolate mountain road. It was what she deserved. Matthew Thorne drove on for a long moment. The snow was falling thicker now, large, wet flakes that clung to his beard and the brim of his hat. The light was failing fast, turning the forest into a maze of deep blue shadows and stark white snow. Finally, he spoke, his voice as calm and steady as it had been in the street. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the road. "Every soul," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble, "carries its own cross, ma'am." And that was all. No questions, no condemnation, just a simple, profound statement of fact, a recognition of shared human frailty. It was an absolution she had not dared to pray for, an acceptance so complete and so unconditional that it left her speechless. The sky, which had been gray all day, now seemed to collapse upon itself, opening up and releasing the full fury of the storm. The snow was no longer falling in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain, a swirling white chaos that erased the world. The track ahead became nearly invisible, a treacherous, narrow ledge cut into the side of the mountain, just wide enough for a single wheel to pass, with a steep, unforgiving drop into the darkness on one side. The wind screamed through the pines, a sound like a hungry animal. They were alone. Two strangers in a world that had been reduced to a maelstrom of snow and wind and encroaching night. They were heading deeper into the wild, toward a home she had never seen, with a man she did not know. The cruel joke that had begun in Missouri had ended here, on this mountainside. And as the buckboard fought its way through the blizzard, Ruthie knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the storm, that this night was not an ending, it was a beginning, a night of reckoning, where one life would end and another, impossibly, was about to begin. The final ascent was a blind struggle against a wall of white. The horse, a creature of immense stamina and mountain sense, lowered its head and leaned into the wind, each step a calculated, plodding effort. Ruthie could see nothing but the broad, snow-caked expanse of Matthew Thorne's back and the swirling chaos of the storm. The world had been reduced to this narrow, precarious moment. She trusted the horse because he trusted it. There was no other choice. Then, the wagon leveled out, and the wind, though still a gale, lost some of its biting force as they entered a thick stand of lodgepole pines that acted as a natural barrier. Through the blur of snow, a dark shape emerged. A cabin. It was low-slung and solid, its roof already bearing a heavy blanket of white. It looked less like a structure built upon the land and more like something that had grown out of it, as elemental as the rock and timber that surrounded it. A thin curl of old, gray smoke clung to the stone chimney, a ghost of a fire long since dead. Matthew brought the horse to a halt under the partial shelter of a large pine. He said nothing, simply wrapping the reins securely before swinging himself down from the buckboard. He moved with an unhurried purpose, his large frame a bulwark against the storm. He came around to her side and reached up. "We're here," he said, the words simple and profound. He lifted her down as if she weighed nothing, his hands sure and steady at her waist. For a moment, her feet sank into the deep snow, and the hem of her dress became instantly soaked and cold. He didn't release her immediately, waiting until she had her balance. Then he turned, retrieved her trunk, and carried it toward the heavy plank door of the cabin, kicking snow away from the threshold before he shouldered it open. He disappeared into the darkness. Ruthie hesitated for only a second before following him out of the blinding white into the deep, silent black of the cabin's interior. The door swung shut behind her with a solid, definitive thud, cutting off the shriek of the wind. The silence that fell was absolute, a deafness of the ears that was almost as loud as the storm had been. The air inside was frigid, thick with the cold scents of pine sap, wood smoke, and something else, the faint, clean smell of dried herbs. She heard the scrape of his boots on the wooden floorboards. Then the soft thud of her trunk being set down. A moment later, there was the sharp, sulphurous scratch of a match. A small flame bloomed in the darkness, and he touched it to the wick of a lantern on a rough-hewn table. Warm, yellow light pushed back the shadows, revealing the heart of the home. It was one large room, meticulously clean and ordered. A great stone fireplace and hearth took up much of one wall, but it was a large, black cast-iron stove that stood at the center of the space, its stovepipe rising straight up through the ceiling. Stacked neatly against the wall was a mountain of firewood, split and sorted by size. A few simple shelves held tin plates, a handful of books, and jars of preserves. In the corner sat a single, high-backed rocking chair, its wooden runners worn smooth. Matthew moved to the stove, his actions economical and precise. He opened the iron door, crumpled a piece of old newspaper, and laid a lattice of kindling inside. He struck another match, and the kindling caught with a hungry crackle. He added larger pieces, and soon a comforting, orange glow began to fill the room, the promise of a heat that was not yet felt but deeply needed. The iron of the stove began to tick softly as it warmed. He turned to her then, his face illuminated by the flickering lamplight. He seemed to notice her standing there, shivering, her shawl clutched around her, a lost and forlorn figure in his doorway. "Please," he said, his voice softer now that it didn't have to compete with the wind. He gestured toward the rocking chair. "Sit, get warm." Ruthie moved toward the chair, her legs feeling like lead. She sank into it, the wood groaning softly under her weight. The chair was positioned to catch the growing warmth from the stove. She watched him as he moved about the cabin. He was not a man of wasted motion. He filled a large kettle with water from a bucket and set it on the stove top. He took a heavy pot from a hook and ladled a thick, dark stew into 2 bowls. The stew had been waiting, kept cold by the ambient chill, ready to be heated. It smelled of venison and root vegetables. He brought one of the bowls to her, along with a spoon. Before he handed it to her, he paused. He went to a small chest against the wall, opened it, and took something out. It was a square of clean, white linen, a handkerchief, neatly folded. He came back and, with that same careful awkwardness she'd felt earlier, he gently unfolded it and laid it across her lap. It was such a small thing, such a gesture of formal, gentle care, that it nearly broke her. No one had done such a thing for her in years. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. He just nodded and retreated to a simple stool on the other side of the stove with his own bowl. They ate in silence, the only sounds the ticking of the stove, the scrape of their spoons against the tin bowls, and the ceaseless, muffled roar of the blizzard outside. The stew was hot and nourishing, and it spread a deep, profound warmth through her chilled body, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. When they were finished, he took her empty bowl and set it aside. He added a large log to the stove, and a shower of bright orange sparks danced up the stovepipe. He settled back onto his stool, his large hands resting on his knees, and looked at the fire for a long time. The cabin was warm now, a cocoon of light and heat against the raging storm. The windows were opaque, plastered with a thick layer of driven snow. Ruthie knew she had to speak again, to finish what she had started on the mountain road. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the warm room. I am so sorry for the deception. It was a wicked thing my family did." He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on the mesmerizing dance of the flames visible through the stove's small grate. "It was not your wickedness, ma'am. But I am not the woman in the advertisement. I am not of good character." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. He was silent for another long moment, and she thought perhaps he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, thoughtful rumble. "My mother died 2 years ago. This was her cabin. She built it with my father. When he passed, she and we stayed on. She was a good woman, full of God's word." He paused, and Ruthie could almost see the memories flickering in his eyes. "Before she went to her reward, she made me promise. She worried about me being alone up here. She said a man needs helpmate, not just for the work. The work is hard, but a man can do it. She said a soul needs a partner, someone to share the work," he repeated, as if tasting the words, "and someone to share the prayers." He finally turned his gaze from the fire and looked at her. His eyes were clear, and they held no judgment, only a deep, abiding weariness. "I wrote those words in the advertisement for her, a God-fearing woman of good character. They were her words. I was just keeping a promise." He looked down at his own calloused, powerful hands. "I don't know about character. I know about hardship. I know about long winters. I know what it is to be alone." He looked up again, his gaze direct and unwavering. He was going to lay out the terms. This was the moment of her true sentencing. "Here is the bargain," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You stay the winter. The snow will soon make the pass to Elk Crossing impossible until spring. You will be safe here. You will be warm. There will be food." He took a breath. "I will make no demands on you. None. We will share the work. We will share the meals. We will live under this roof as partners in survival. When the thaw comes, if you wish to leave, I will take you back to town myself. That is the agreement." Ruthie stared at him, unable to process the sheer, unadorned decency of his offer. Sanctuary, not a marriage sentence, not an ownership, but an offer of shelter. Freely given, a partnership. The tears she had held back for so long finally came. They weren't the hot, shameful tears of humiliation, but quiet, grateful tears that traced clean paths through the grime of her long journey. She didn't sob, just let them fall. "Thank you," she managed to say. the two words feeling utterly inadequate. He gave a short, stiff nod, clearly uncomfortable with her tears, and turned his attention back to the fire. An hour passed in that comfortable, warm silence. The storm outside seemed to be trying to tear the world apart, its fury a constant, deep-throated howl. But inside the small cabin, there was a profound and growing sense of peace. Later, when the fire was banked for the night, Matthew rose from his stool. He went to the shelves and took down one of the books. It was a Bible, its leather cover dark and worn, much like her own. He brought the lantern closer to his stool and opened it to a page marked with a thin strip of leather. "My mother," he said softly. "She liked to read a psalm before sleeping. I have kept the habit." He began to read, his deep voice filling the cabin, a steady, calm anchor against the chaos of the storm. He read the 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." As he spoke the ancient, comforting words, something inside Ruthie that had been coiled tight for months, a hard knot of fear and shame and despair, began to loosen. The words washed over her, a balm on a wound she thought would never heal. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." She closed her eyes and, for the first time since that terrible day in her father's parlor, she took a full, deep breath that filled her lungs completely, a breath that did not catch on a sob or a spike of fear. She breathed out, and with that exhalation, a measure of the poison seemed to leave her. When he finished reading, he closed the book gently. The room was quiet again, save for the wind and the fire. He stood up. "The other room is through that door," he said, gesturing to a simple plank door she hadn't paid much mind to. "It was my mother's. It is yours now. There is a bed, and clean linens in the chest." He then went to a corner and unrolled a thick buffalo hide and a stack of wool blankets, laying them out on the floorboards near the hearth. On his side of the stove, he was creating a border, a clear, unspoken line of respect. He was giving her the room, the bed, the privacy. He was taking the floor. She stood, her body aching with a weariness that was bone deep. "Good night, Mr. Thorne." "Good night, ma'am," he replied. She went into the small room and closed the door. It was sparse, containing only a simple bed frame with a thick mattress stuffed with straw or corn husks, a small wooden chest, and a single window. The window was a black square, rattling in its frame as the wind-driven snow hammered against the glass. But inside, two strangers, brought together by a cruel joke and a solemn promise, were settling in for the night under the same roof, separated by a thin wooden door, but united by the shared warmth of a fire and the echo of a sacred psalm. As Matthew lay in the darkness, listening to the storm, he knew this was only a temporary solution. The winter would provide a shield, but spring would come, and with spring, questions would come. He thought of the circuit-riding preacher, Reverend Miller, who made his rounds through these remote valleys twice a year. He was due before the passes closed for good. A man of God, a man who understood the right way of things. Matthew stared into the darkness, the weight of the situation settling upon him. He had thought all night on the ride up the mountain, and now, in the quiet of his home, he knew a decision had to be made. He had to figure out the right thing to do, not just for the winter, but for good. The world was born new in the morning, muffled and white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, cathedral-like silence. Snow was piled in soft, sculptural drifts against the cabin, burying the world they had known under a blanket of pure, untouched peace. Inside, the warmth from the stove was a tangible presence, a shield against the vast, frozen wilderness that began just outside their door. Ruthie had woken in the small, dark room to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. She had dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons in the cold, and emerged to find Matthew Thorne already moving about the main room. his morning chores nearly complete. He had shoveled a path to the woodpile and the outhouse, and his cheeks were ruddy with the cold. He nodded a simple "good morning" to her and gestured to a plate he had set on the table, laden with bacon and a piece of skillet-fried bread. They ate as they had the night before, in a silence that was not awkward but full. It was the silence of two people who understood that words were a currency to be spent with care in a world where so much depended on action. She cleared the plates while he checked the action on one of his rifles, his large hands moving with an expert, practiced grace. A fragile, unspoken rhythm was beginning to form between them, the first tentative steps of a dance of cohabitation. She felt a sliver of something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, a sense of safety. It was mid-morning when the sound came, a sharp, percussive knock on the door. It was so unexpected in their isolated world that both of them froze. Matthew was on his feet in an instant, his quiet demeanor replaced by a watchful stillness. He took the rifle from the table, not aiming it, but holding it ready at his side. He moved to the door and called out, his voice a low command. "Who's there?" A voice answered, strained and breathless against the wind that had begun to pick up again. "Reverend Miller, circuit preacher, caught in the blowback. My horse is spent, requesting shelter in the Lord's name." Matthew's posture relaxed. He leaned the rifle against the wall and lifted the heavy bar securing the door. He pulled it open, and a blast of frigid air and swirling snow swept into the cabin. Framed in the doorway stood a man, short and wiry, his face chapped raw by the wind and his beard encrusted with ice. He looked less like a man of the cloth and more like a frozen gnome, but his eyes, when he blinked the snow from them, were clear and kind. "Come in, Reverend. Come in out of the cold," Matthew said, stepping back to allow him entry. "God's blessings on this house," the preacher rasped, stumbling inside and pulling the door shut against the wind. He stamped the snow from his boots and began to peel off his frozen gloves, his fingers blue with cold. "Matthew Thorne, I had hoped I might find you well. The storm came on faster than I reckoned." "There's hot coffee on the stove," Matthew said, taking the man's snow-covered coat, "and stew to warm you." The Reverend's eyes fell upon Ruthie, who stood uncertainly by the hearth. His gaze was curious but gentle. He saw the swell of her belly, but his expression registered only mild surprise, not the leering judgment she had come to expect. Matthew made the introduction simply. "Reverend, this is Miss Ruthie. She arrived yesterday." "A pleasure, ma'am," the Reverend said with a tired but genuine smile, giving a small bow. "Forgive my intrusion. The Lord's work sometimes puts a man at the mercy of his weather." Ruthie murmured a quiet greeting as Matthew ladled a steaming bowl of stew for their guest. The preacher ate ravenously, his hands shaking slightly as the warmth began to seep back into them. He spoke of his journey, of families down in the lower valley, of a new baby born and an old man laid to rest. He was the thread that tied these scattered, isolated homesteads together, a bearer of news and faith. When he had finished, he sighed with contentment and held his hands out to the warmth of the stove. "Now," he said, his voice stronger, "I can see to my horse, and then, Matthew, if you have need of prayer, or any matter of the soul you wish to discuss." Matthew, who had been standing by the fireplace, his expression thoughtful and remote, turned to face the preacher. He did not sit. He stood to his full, formidable height, a man who seemed to take up all the space in the small, warm cabin. "Reverend," he said, his voice low and steady, "we have need of more than prayer. I would ask you to perform a marriage." The words dropped into the quiet room with the weight of stones. The ticking of the iron stove was suddenly deafening. The Reverend stared, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Ruthie's heart gave a violent lurch, and all the air seemed to rush from her lungs. She felt the blood drain from her face. The Reverend recovered first. "A marriage now." "Yes," Matthew said, "right now." Ruthie found her voice, a choked, panicked whisper. She took a step forward, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. Mr. Thorne, no, you don't have to do this. It was a plea. She was offering him a final chance to escape the bargain, to cast her out before he tied himself to her shame irrevocably. This was an act of pity, a terrible, noble burden he was forcing upon himself, and she could not bear it. Matthew turned his head and looked at her. His stone-gray eyes were not filled with pity, nor duty, nor resignation. They were filled with a calm, unshakable certainty. "It is not a have to—" "Ruthie," he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice was both strange and solid. "It is a choice, my choice." He turned back to the stunned preacher. "Will you do it, Reverend?" Reverend Miller looked from Matthew's resolute face to Ruthie's pale, tear-streaked one. He saw the truth of her condition, and he saw the steadfast resolve in the mountain man's eyes. He was a man who understood the hard necessities of life in the wilderness, and he understood the sacred gravity of what was being asked. He slowly nodded. "If you are both of willing heart and mind, then yes, the Lord's work waits for no thaw." There were no preparations. There were no flowers, no rings, no fine clothes. The wedding ceremony was as stark and as beautiful as the snow-covered mountains outside. Their witness was the tired, half-frozen preacher. Their audience was the storm and the silent, watchful pines. Reverend Miller had them stand before the hearth, the warm glow of the banked fire casting long, flickering shadows on the log walls. He took out his own worn Bible, its pages softened by the hands of 100 seeking souls in 100 lonely cabins. "We have no bread for communion," the preacher said softly, "but any bread broken in fellowship is holy." Matthew went to the cupboard and brought back the skillet bread left over from breakfast. He broke off a piece and handed it to the Reverend. He took a dipper of fresh, cold water from the bucket by the door. This was their wedding feast, a scrap of unleavened bread and a sip of spring water. The Reverend cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice filling the small space with a quiet authority. He did not read the usual passages about marriage. Instead, he turned the pages of his Bible until he found the book he was looking for. "From the book of Ruth," he said, his eyes meeting Ruthie's, and Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee for whither thou goest. I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." The word hung in the air, in the scent of pine smoke and wet wool. Faithful, the story of a woman, an outsider, who found a home through steadfast, loyal love. Tears welled in Ruthie's eyes, but these were not tears of shame. They were tears of an overwhelming, incomprehensible grace. The Reverend asked them to join hands. Matthew's hand was large and calloused, engulfing her own small, cold one. His touch was warm and firm. It was a hand that knew work, a hand that could build or break, and it was holding hers with a startling gentleness. They spoke the ancient vows, their voices quiet in the solemn room. Ruthie's voice trembled when she spoke her part, a promise to love, honor, and obey, a vow she never in her life dreamed she would make. Matthew's voice was a low, steady rumble, each word a stone being laid for a new foundation, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. As he spoke, a furious gust of wind hammered against the window pane, rattling it in its frame. The storm was raging its last, but inside the cabin, there was a profound and unshakable peace. "Till death do us part." The Reverend took the piece of bread. "This is the bread of your new life together. Share it in hope." He gave half to Matthew and half to Ruthie. They ate. He held the dipper of water. "This is the water of your journey. Share it in faith." They drank. Then the preacher smiled, his tired face illuminated by the firelight. "By the authority vested in me by God and the Montana Territory, I now pronounce you man and wife." For a long moment, no one moved. They simply stood, their hands still joined. Two strangers bound together by a storm and a promise. Then Matthew gently released her hand. He did not kiss her. Instead, he did something far more permanent. He walked to the massive central log post that supported the main roof beam. It was the heart of the cabin, the tree around which the entire home had been built. From the sheath on his belt, he drew his hunting knife. The blade was long and sharp, honed by years of skinning game and carving wood. It was the tool of a survivor. He knelt. In the quiet of the cabin, the only sound was the scratch and whisper of the knife's tip against the aged pine. The Reverend and Ruthie watched, transfixed. Slowly, with deep, deliberate strokes, he began to carve letters into the wood. He was not a man of letters, but his hands, so used to precise work, were steady. Shavings of pale wood curled away from the blade. He carved a single word, first Ruth. Then, below it, another thorn. He had given her his name. He had written it into the very heartwood of his home. It was not a brand of ownership, but a declaration of belonging. This was her place now. This was her name. She was no longer the cast-off, the joke from Missouri. She was Ruth Thorne. He stood, wiping the blade on his trousers before sheathing it. He looked at his work. Then he looked at her. A silent question, a silent statement. In that moment, a lone wolf howled from the deep woods, a long, mournful cry that spoke of the vast, wild world outside their door. But inside, in the small, warm cabin, two strangers had become a family. The howl was not a threat. It was a song for their wedding day. That night, after the Reverend had taken his leave, his strength renewed and his spirit light, the quiet rhythm of the cabin returned. Matthew read from the Psalms again, his voice a comforting presence in the growing dark. When it was time to sleep, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He unrolled his bedroll and blankets on the floor by the hearth. He was her husband now, in the eyes of God and the law. But the invisible line of respect he had drawn on that first night remained. He was a man of his word. This marriage was a shelter, a fortress against the storm. The path to its heart was a different journey, one that had not yet begun. He gave her a simple nod. "Good night, Mrs. Thorne." She went into the small room and closed the door, her new name echoing in the quiet of her heart. The boundary held, a testament to the character of the man who had chosen her. For now, the most violent storms were the ones that raged outside the cabin walls. Life in the cabin fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the snow. The days after the preacher's departure were a quiet unfolding, a slow and deliberate education in the art of survival and partnership. Their marriage was a fact, carved into the heart of the house. But their life together was a language they were learning one word, one shared task at a time. The boundary of the bedroom door remained, a silent testament to the honorable terms Matthew had set. But in the main room, in the barn, in the endless white landscape that was their world, all other boundaries began to soften and dissolve. Her first lesson began in the small, tight barn that leaned against the side of a granite outcrop. The air inside was thick with the warm, sweet smell of hay and the earthy scent of their single milk cow, a placid Jersey named Beth. Matthew had built the barn himself, and it was as sturdy and practical as he was. "She's gentle," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet space. He handed Ruthie a low, three-legged stool and a clean wooden pail. "Just needs a firm but gentle hand. She knows the routine." Ruthie approached the cow with trepidation. She had milked cows before, on her father's farm, but that felt like a lifetime ago. This was different. This was not a chore done under the resentful eyes of her brothers. This was a contribution. This was her work in their shared life. She sat on the stool, the cow's warm flank radiating a comforting heat. She placed the pail beneath the udder and tentatively wrapped her cold fingers around a teat. It was softer and warmer than she expected. "Firmly," Matthew's voice instructed from behind her. "But don't pinch. Squeeze from the top down. A rolling motion. like this. He knelt beside her, his large frame making the small space feel even tighter. He didn't touch her hands. Instead, he placed his own on the cow and demonstrated the motion, a smooth, practiced pull that resulted in a sharp, hissing stream of white milk striking the bottom of his own pail. She tried to imitate him. Her first attempt was clumsy, a weak, fumbling squeeze that produced nothing. She flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I used to know how—" "Knowing and doing are two different rivers," he said, his voice patient. "Try again." She took a breath, focused, and squeezed, pulling down with more conviction. A thin stream of milk shot out sideways, missing the pail completely and spattering against the wooden wall of the stall. A hot wave of frustration washed over her. She was failing at the simplest of tasks. Matthew made a sound that was almost a chuckle. "The first shot is always for the barn ghosts. Now you've paid your dues. Try again." His patience was a balm. She tried again, and this time, a stream of milk hit the bottom of the pail with a satisfying ping, then another, and another. Soon, she found the rhythm, a steady push and pull, and the pinging sound was replaced by the soft, frothy hiss of milk hitting milk. It was a peaceful, domestic sound, a sound of sustenance and life. She fell into the rhythm of it, her mind growing quiet, focused only on the task, on the warmth of the cow and the steady, growing weight of the pail. It was a small success, but it felt like a victory. Her next lesson took place in the snow-dusted clearing beside the woodpile. Matthew had a large splitting stump, its surface scarred and splintered from years of work. He showed her how he could split a large log with a single, powerful swing of his heavy maul. But that was not her task. "Every fire needs a heart," he explained, picking up a smaller axe, a hatchet with a well-worn handle, and the heart is kindling. Small pieces, dry as bone, that can catch a spark and turn it into a flame. He showed her how to set a larger piece of split pine on the block and find the grain. "You don't fight the wood," he said. "You persuade it." He handed her the hatchet. It was heavier than it looked, the balance unfamiliar in her hand. Her first swing was hesitant, glancing off the wood with a dull thud. "You're holding it like a broom," he said, not unkindly. He stepped behind her, his presence a wall of warmth at her back. "Here." He reached around her, his hands covering hers on the handle of the hatchet. His chest was close to her shoulder blades. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart through his thick wool coat. Her own heart gave a sudden, panicked flutter. It was the closest they had been, a practical, instructional closeness that felt more intimate than any touch she had ever known. "Grip it here," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. He adjusted her fingers, placing them firmly on the smooth, worn hickory. "Keep your wrists straight. Let the weight of the axe do the work. It's not about strength. It's about aim." Together, they lifted the hatchet. His strength guided hers, his knowledge flowing through his hands into hers. They brought it down in a single, clean arc. There was a sharp, satisfying crack as the blade bit deep, and the piece of pine fell apart in two perfect, slivered halves. A sound escaped Ruthie's lips, a sound she hadn't made in years. It was a laugh, not a small, polite titter, but a sudden, surprised burst of genuine joy. It was the sound of a small, perfect success, of a shared effort, of the simple, clean snap of wood breaking just as it should. Matthew stepped back, releasing her hands. He was smiling. It wasn't a wide grin, but a slow crinkling at the corners of his stone-gray eyes, a slight softening of his mouth. It transformed his stern, stoic face, revealing a kindness she had only glimpsed. The sound of her laugh and the sight of his smile hung in the cold, crisp air between them. A moment of unguarded warmth that changed the landscape of their relationship more than any vow. The weeks of deep winter settled in, and their life took on the comforting shape of routine. The mountain had its own calendar, Mornings were Matthew's time. He would be gone before dawn, a silent shadow moving on snowshoes to check his trap lines, returning with the sunrise, his beard frosted with ice, sometimes with a brace of rabbits or a prime fox slung over his shoulder. Afternoons were for shared work, mending a fence post that had buckled under the snow's weight, sharpening tools by the fire, rendering fat into tallow for candles. Evenings became the quiet heart of their day. After their silent supper, Matthew would take out his mother's Bible and read a passage, his low voice a steady counterpoint to the howling wind. Ruthie would take out her sewing basket. She mended the small tears in his coats, darned his wool socks, her needle moving with a quiet, rhythmic purpose. The cabin, once a space of solitary male existence, began to change. The air grew softer, holding the scent of her lavender sachet tucked in her trunk, and, on some days, the warm, yeasty smell of bread baking in the cast-iron stove. The room was now filled with the sound of two people, the soft scratch of her needle, the rustle of a page being turned, the steady ticking of the stove, the clink of a spoon against a mug. It was the sound of a house becoming a home. One afternoon, a man from a lower homestead made his way up the trail on snowshoes, bringing supplies from elk crossing that Matthew had arranged for weeks before. Among the sacks of flour and salt was a single, sealed letter. It was not from Missouri. The handwriting was the careful, looping script of an educated man. It was addressed to Matthew. That evening, after their meal, he sat by the lantern and opened it. Ruthie watched him from her rocking chair, her sewing still in her lap. As he read, his face, usually so calm and unreadable, hardened. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He read the single page twice, his expression growing more distant, more thoughtful with each word. The letter was from a reverend in a neighboring valley, a colleague of the preacher who had married them. It was a letter of cautious, pastoral concern, a warning. A marriage made in haste under the duress of a winter storm is a fragile foundation. A line read, "The bonds of matrimony must be built on truth and time, lest they break under the first thaw of spring." When he was finished, Matthew didn't refold the letter. He stared at it for a long moment, his face a mask of stone. Then, he deliberately reached over, opened the door of the iron stove, and dropped the paper onto the glowing orange coals. It curled, blackened, and vanished in a bright, silent flare of orange flame. He closed the stove door with a quiet click and said nothing of what it had contained. But the act was a statement louder than any words. He had made his choice. He would allow no outside doubt to poison the fragile peace they had built. The small moment of connection they'd found while splitting wood began to replicate itself in other, quieter ways. One evening at supper, as she reached for the salt cellar, her hand brushed his as he was reaching for the bread. It was the barest whisper of a touch, skin against skin. In her old life, such a touch would have been followed by an immediate, apologetic retreat. But here, in the warm glow of the lantern, neither of them pulled away. For a half-second that stretched into a small eternity, their hands hovered near each other over the rough-hewn table. They both looked up. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, a new understanding passed between them. The distance across the table, the distance between his bedroll and her room, seemed to shrink by half a breath. With the child inside her growing stronger, a new and powerful instinct began to stir in Ruthie. Hope. It was a dangerous, tender thing, a green shoot pushing its way through frozen ground. One evening, sifting through her small trunk, she found a bundle of scrap wool, leftovers from her mother's knitting. It wasn't much, just odd lengths of soft, undyed yarn. She took out her needles and, in the quiet hours by the fire while Matthew read, she began to knit. She started with a simple, small square, then another. Her fingers, at first clumsy, soon remembered the old, familiar motions. The project slowly took shape. A tiny sleeve, the gentle curve of a neckline, She was knitting a small sack, an infant's first garment. It was a quiet, determined act of faith. She was no longer just the shamed girl sent away from Missouri. She was a wife in a warm cabin, a mother preparing for the arrival of her child. The tiny woolen garment growing under her hands was a prayer made tangible, a hope she could hold. The winter held them in its white, silent embrace. But they both knew the world was larger than their small valley. Whispers, like wind, could travel. Matthew had seen the way the men in Elk Crossing looked at him now, a mixture of pity and crude curiosity. And somewhere, on a mail wagon struggling through the muddy, thawing roads of the plains, was another letter. This one was from Missouri. It was not a letter of warning or of concern. It was a letter addressed to him, carrying the weight of an old, buried sin. A story from his father's past that was about to find its way to his doorstep and threatened to tear down the house of mercy he had so carefully, so deliberately, begun to build. The first thaw came not as a gentle promise, but as a sullen surrender. The world. For months, a pristine canvas of white, bled into shades of gray and brown. The snowpack slumped, weeping cold, muddy water into the gullies. The air, though still sharp, carried a new damp scent of thawing earth and rotting leaves. It was a time of transition, a messy, in-between season where the purity of winter gave way to the grime of the world beneath. It was during this break in the weather that the need for supplies became a necessity, not just a thought. The journey down to Elk Crossing was a treacherous one. The familiar track was now a channel of mud and slush, the wagon wheels sinking deep, the horse straining with every step. The town, when they finally reached it, seemed louder, cruder, and more crowded than Ruthie remembered. The temporary seal of winter had been broken, and trappers, prospectors, and homesteaders had all come down from the high country, hungry for goods and human contact. The general store was a hive of activity, a cacophony of stomping boots, loud talk, and the clang of the cash drawer. It smelled of damp wool, chewing tobacco, and coffee, while Matthew negotiated with the proprietor for sacks of flour, salt, and beans, a task that required his full, focused attention. Ruthie moved toward the back of the store. Here, bolts of fabric were stacked on rough-hewn shelves, a rare splash of color in the drab, utilitarian space. She ran her hand over a length of soft, brushed flannel, imagining it as diapers, as a soft blanket for the life that was growing ever more present within her. She was absorbed in her task, calculating how much she would need. When she became aware of the voices, they were low, pitched for confidentiality but sharpened by malice, coming from two women warming their backsides by the store's potbelly stove. She recognized them as wives from the lower valley, women whose faces were pinched with the hardship of their lives and the sourness of their dispositions. "Saw him pull up. The first woman, a Mrs. Gable," was saying, her voice a dry rustle. "With her, bold as brass, sitting right there on the wagon seat." "I heard she came on the freight wagon just before the first snow," replied the second. "A Mrs. Pritchard, sent for, they say, like a mail-order chicken." Mrs. Gable gave a short, ugly laugh. "More like second-hand goods, I'd say, from the looks of her, already carrying another man's burden. What sort of man takes on a problem like that?" "You know about those mountain men," Mrs. Pritchard whispered, leaning closer. "They live like bears. Thorne has always been a strange one. Comes from a bad line. I've heard my husband say, quiet doesn't mean clean. He probably saw a chance for a ready-made heir and a woman who couldn't say no." The words were like wasps, stinging and poisonous. Ruthie stood frozen, her back to them, her hand still resting on the soft flannel. A hot, sickening flush crept up her neck, followed by an icy chill. The bright patterns of the calico and gingham suddenly seemed to fade, turning as gray and muddy as the street outside. Her world, the safe, quiet world she had built with Matthew in their cabin, had been breached. The ugliness of Elk Crossing, of her past, had found her. She instinctively moved her other hand to rest over her belly, a primal gesture of protection. She did not turn. She did not confront them. She simply stood, a statue of feigned indifference, until their venomous whispers turned to other, less interesting town gossip. When Matthew finished his business, he found her by the shelves, her face pale, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the store's grimy window. He must have sensed the change in her, the sudden tension in her posture, but he said nothing. He simply loaded their supplies, helped her onto the wagon, and they began the long, arduous journey home. At the small post office, a corner of the general store, the clerk had handed Matthew a letter along with his receipt. It was a thin, flimsy envelope, postmarked from a town in Missouri she'd never heard of. It had traveled a long way to find him. He had tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat without looking at it, his focus on the task of getting them and their precious supplies safely back up the mountain. The silence on the ride home was different from their usual quiet companionship. This was a heavy, weighted silence, filled with the things she had heard and the things he had not asked. Snow had begun to fall again. Not a blizzard this time, but a thick, wet fall of flakes that clung to the trees and muted all sound. A soft, white curtain drawing around their wagon, hiding them from the world. Back in the warmth of the cabin, the tension remained. The space that had felt like a sanctuary now felt small, the log walls seeming to press in on them. They put away the supplies, moving around each other in a wide, silent circle. Each busied themselves with unnecessary tasks, she restacking the firewood that was already perfectly stacked, he meticulously cleaning a rifle that was already clean. They were avoiding each other's eyes, avoiding the conversation that hung in the air like smoke. After their spare, silent meal, he finally took the letter from his coat. He sat at the table, his back to her, and turned up the lantern's wick. She watched the straight, unyielding line of his spine as he broke the seal. He unfolded the single, thin sheet of paper. She saw the change happen even from across the room. She saw the muscles in his broad shoulders stiffen, as if bracing for a blow. He did not move for a full minute, just stared at the page, the scrawled handwriting a mystery to her. When he finally lowered the letter, his hand, a hand she had seen split logs with a single blow, was trembling slightly. He clenched it into a fist, crushing the paper into a tight, wrinkled ball. He rose from the table and walked to the stove, his movements stiff and mechanical. He opened the iron door, and for a moment she thought he would burn this letter as he had the other one. But he did not. He simply stood there, staring into the flames, the crushed letter still in his hand. The letter was from an old acquaintance of his father's, a man named Josiah from their hometown in Missouri. It was a letter of condolence, years late, on the death of his mother. But that was not its true purpose. It was a letter of confession, a clearing of a guilty conscience. Josiah wrote of a time 20 years before, a time of fear and suspicion. 3 travelers, strangers with foreign accents, had passed through their county. A prized stallion had gone missing the same night. A posse was formed, fueled by whiskey and righteousness. Matthew's father, a hard man and a leader in the community, had been at its head. They had tracked the travelers, found them with a horse they claimed to have bought, and in the swift, brutal justice of the frontier, had hanged all 3 of them from a cottonwood tree by the river. 2 weeks later, the stallion had wandered back to its pasture, having simply broken through a fence. The man who had sold the horse to the travelers came forward, terrified, admitting the truth. The travelers had been innocent, but the posse, Matthew's father included, had closed ranks. The story was buried. The sin was never acknowledged, the guilt never atoned for. Reading the words, Matthew felt a cold sickness spread through him. It was not just the story of a forgotten injustice. It was the story of his own blood. The same blood that ran in his veins had been part of a mob that had murdered innocent men. He thought of his quiet offer of sanctuary to Ruthie, of his simple creed to offer mercy instead of judgment. It all felt like a lie, a hypocrisy. He, a thorn, was in no position to grant grace. His very name felt stained. His legacy not one of quiet dignity, but of unpunished violence. The blood in his own veins felt tainted. He finally turned from the fire, his face a pale, grim mask. His lips were a thin, white line. He looked at Ruthie, at her gentle face, at the trusting way she watched him, and he felt a chasm open between them. How could he be a safe harbor for her when his own foundations were built on such rotten ground? Without a word, he grabbed his heavy capote from its peg by the door. He put on his hat, pulling it down low. "The wind is rising," Ruthie said softly, a question in her voice. "A storm is coming." "I have to check the high traps," he said, his voice flat and hard, "before the snow buries them." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The traps could wait. He was not going to work. He was running. He opened the door, and the wind tore into the cabin, guttural and wild, carrying a blast of snow with it. He stepped out into the swirling darkness and pulled the door shut behind him, leaving her alone in the sudden, deafening silence. He leaned into the storm, the wind a physical blow against his chest, the snow a blinding shroud. He welcomed it. He wanted the punishment of the cold, the fury of the wind to scour the poison of his father's past from his soul. In his breast pocket, the letter was a cold, hard knot against his heart, a weight he did not know how to carry, a sin he did not know how to absolve. Hours later, he returned, a figure of ice and exhaustion. The storm had broken him, leaving a hollowed-out calm in its wake. As he stumbled toward the cabin, he saw the light in the window, a single steady point of gold in the vast, tumultuous darkness. It was a beacon. It was home. He pushed the door open, expecting to find her asleep, but she was there, sitting in the rocking chair, her sewing in her lap, the lantern on the table beside her casting a warm glow on her face. She had been waiting for him. She looked up as he entered, her expression not one of anger or fear, but of a deep, quiet concern. And then she smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was a smile of welcome, of acceptance. It was a smile that asked for nothing and offered everything. It was mercy, given freely. He stood there, dripping snow and mud onto the clean floor, the icy weight of his father's sins still heavy in his heart, and looked at his wife's forgiving face. He knew then that the storm he had just walked through was nothing. The greatest storm of all had not yet broken. The winter did not release its grip. It tightened it. February arrived not with the promise of a distant spring, but with the full, unbridled fury of the high country. A storm, born somewhere over the frozen spine of the continent, descended upon their valley. It was a living entity, a thing of violence and power. The wind was not a sound, but a solid thing. A battering ram that slammed against the log walls of the cabin, seeking entry. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, stinging wall of white that erased the world, burying fences and transforming the familiar landscape into a hostile, alien terrain. For 2 days, they were prisoners in their ark of warmth and light. The rhythm of their lives slowed to the bare essentials, keeping the fire fed, melting snow for water, tending to the cow in the small, sheltered barn. The silence between them had returned, but it was a different kind. It was the quiet of two people braced against a common enemy, a shared understanding of their own fragility in the face of such overwhelming power. The ghost of the letter from Missouri, of Matthew's father's sin, had not vanished, but it had been pushed to the background by the more immediate threat of the storm. On the third night, the storm reached its crescendo. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow-laden pines around the cabin groaned, their branches cracking under the immense weight. It was in the midst of this elemental chaos that Matthew heard the sound. It was a low, guttural moan, different from the howl of the wind. It came from the barn. He pulled on his heavy capote and lit a lantern. "It's Beth," he said to Ruthie, his voice tight. Her time is coming. Ruthie, her own body heavy and cumbersome in the final weeks of her pregnancy, looked up from the hearth, her face etched with concern. In this, calves don't wait on the weather, he said, his hand already on the door. He paused. Bar the door behind me. I'll knock 3 times when I'm back. He plunged into the white maelstrom. The journey to the barn, a matter of a few dozen yards, was a brutal, disorienting battle. The wind tore the breath from his lungs, and the lantern cast a pathetic, dancing circle of light that was swallowed by the swirling darkness. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay and fear. Beth was down in her stall, her great brown eyes wide with pain and exhaustion. She was struggling, her body heaving with contractions that produced nothing. Matthew set the lantern on a high ledge and knelt beside her. He ran a practiced hand over her side, his touch surprisingly gentle. He was a man who understood the mechanics of life and death. He saw at once that the calf was breech, its legs tangled, unable to make its way into the world. For the next hour, he worked. The barn became a primal theater of struggle. It was a battle of muscle, leverage, and a deep, intuitive knowledge of animal bodies. He spoke to the cow in a low, soothing murmur, the same cadence he used with his mules, a stream of encouragement and calm. He had to reach inside, into the heat and darkness of the birthing canal, to untangle the calf's legs. The air was electric with effort and fear. The only sounds the grunts of the laboring man, the pained moans of the mother cow, and the ceaseless, screaming wind outside. Finally, with a great, heaving pull that took all of his strength, the calf came free in a rush of fluid and blood. It was alive, a slick, trembling miracle on the hay-strewn floor. As he cleared its nose and mouth, it gave a weak, bleeding cry and struggled to lift its oversized head. Beth, exhausted but victorious, began to lick her newborn clean. Matthew slumped back against the wall of the stall, his arms and back screaming with effort, his body slick with sweat despite the biting cold. He had done it. He had wrestled life from the jaws of a difficult birth. He felt a wave of profound, weary satisfaction. He was a bringer of life. The thought was a quiet prayer, a silent defiance to the ghost of his father. It was then he heard it. Faintly, almost lost in the roar of the storm, came a cry from the house. It was not a call for help. It was a sharp, involuntary sound of pain. Ruthie. His exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so fierce it made his heart hammer against his ribs. He scrambled to his feet and plunged back out into the storm. Fighting his way back to the cabin, he banged 3 times on the door, his fist a frantic, desperate drumbeat. When the bar was lifted and the door swung open, he saw her. She was standing in the middle of the room, her hands pressed against the small of her back, her face pale and beaded with sweat in the lamplight. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of terror and fierce resolve. "Matthew," she gasped, the word torn from her. "It's time. The baby is coming." The universe had played its hand. 2 labors, 2 struggles for life, unfolding in parallel in the heart of the storm. The man who had just delivered a calf was now being called upon to deliver his own child. All the careful plans they had made for the midwife from the lower valley to be summoned, for a neighbor to assist, were now just useless fantasies, buried under 10 feet of impassable snow. There was only him and her and the storm. A wave of cold, sharp fear pierced him, more chilling than the wind. He was a man of the wilderness, skilled with an axe and a rifle, but this was a different territory, a sacred, terrifying ground he had never walked. But then he looked at her face, at the trust in her eyes, and the fear was replaced by a grim, absolute determination. He would not fail her. "Get to the bed," he commanded, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'll get the water." The cabin transformed into a delivery room. He stoked the fire until the stove roared, and he put every kettle and pot they owned on to boil. He tore strips from the cleanest linen sheets his mother had carefully packed away in a cedar chest. He scrubbed his hands raw with harsh lye soap until they were red, washing away the smell of the barn, washing away the memory of the difficult birth that had come before. His hands, the hands of a trapper and a woodsman, felt clumsy and huge as he tried to make her comfortable. He wiped her brow with a cool cloth. He held her hand during the waves of pain that crashed over her, his own knuckles white. The labor was hard and fast. The storm outside seemed to be in concert with the storm inside her body, each gust of wind a match for each searing contraction. The house, their small ark, became a crucible. Hours passed. The night deepened. Ruthie's strength began to ebb. She was lost in a world of pain, her courage worn thin by exhaustion. After a particularly brutal wave, she fell back against the pillows, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "I can't," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound, tears streaming down her temples into her hair. "I can't do it. Matthew, I'm not strong enough." He knelt by the bed, his large, rough hand enclosing hers. He leaned close, his voice low and urgent, forcing her to hear him over the storm within and without. "Ruthie, look at me." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused with pain. "Listen to me," he said, his voice as solid and unshakable as the mountains. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. You crossed half a country alone. You stood up to scorn. You have built a life here out of nothing but grit and grace. You can do this. You are doing this." His words were not just encouragement. They were a testament. They were the truth, and she heard it. A flicker of her old resolve returned to her eyes. She squeezed his hand, a faint but definite pressure. The final stage was a blur of focused, desperate effort. He was no longer a frightened man. He was a partner in the most elemental of creations. His voice was her anchor, his hands her support. The world narrowed to the flickering lamplight, the groaning of the bed frame, and her ragged, powerful breaths. And then, a moment of terrible, absolute silence. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. The fire in the stove seemed to quiet. It was the silent, terrifying pause between one world and the next. Into that silence, a new sound was born. It was not a weak cry, but a furious, lusty wail, a sound that tore through the fabric of the storm and filled the cabin with its raw, vibrant declaration of life. It was a sound of victory. Matthew, his hands trembling but steadier than they had ever been in his life, lifted the small, slippery body. A boy. He breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he had no name for. "Ruthie, we have a son." He cleaned the infant and wrapped him in the softest, warmest flannel they had. He laid the small, squirming bundle in Ruthie's arms. She was exhausted, pale, but her face was transfigured. A light shone from within her that was brighter than any lantern. She looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face of her son, at the tuft of dark hair, and she touched his cheek with one finger. "Mercy," she whispered, the name a prayer. "His name is Mercy. Mercy." The word hung in the warm, still air of the cabin. It was the grace he had shown her. It was the forgiveness she had given herself. It was the gift they had now been given. Later, as Ruthie slept the deep sleep of exhaustion, Matthew sat in the rocking chair, holding his son. The storm outside had finally begun to exhaust its fury. The wind no longer shrieked but sighed, and the snow fell now in a soft, gentle veil. He looked down at the infant cradled in his arms. This perfect, innocent life, this was his son, a thorn, but a new kind of thorn. He thought of his father, of the letter, of the weight of a sin he had not committed but had inherited. Holding this child, he felt that weight shift. This was his chance to break the chain, to start a new legacy, not of violence and buried guilt, but of quiet strength and unearned grace. He began to sing, his voice a low, rough baritone. It was a hymn his mother had sung to him when he was a boy, a simple song of praise and protection. He sang it to his son, Mercy Thorn, as the last of the great storm passed over their valley. as the first pale light of dawn crept through the snow-caked windows. The world outside was silent, peaceful, and clean. The name Mercy was a soft promise on their lips. But in the new fallen snow, on the single track that led up the mountain to their door, a shadow was already forming. The world they had held at bay was coming for them, and its footsteps were dark on the pure, white trail. The days that followed were a quiet hymn of new life. The cabin, once a bastion against the storm, was now a sanctuary for the fragile peace that had been born within it. The world was Mercy. It was the infant's soft, milky scent, the surprising strength in his tiny, grasping fingers, the rhythm of his breathing as he slept in his cradle by the hearth, a cradle Matthew had carved from a smooth, pale piece of aspen wood. The presence of the child had filled the silences that the letter from Missouri had created. The specter of Matthew's father's sin had not disappeared, but it had receded, dwarfed by the immediate, overwhelming reality of new fatherhood. When Matthew looked at his son, he felt not the stain of his bloodline, but the fierce, cleansing imperative to protect this new, innocent life. For Ruthie, the shame of the past had been washed away in the crucible of childbirth. She was no longer defined by her journey to this place, but by her purpose within it. She was a mother. She was a wife. She was home. This fragile peace was shattered on a cold, bright afternoon a week after Mercy's birth. The sun was a weak disk in a pale blue sky, and the light reflecting off the immense blanket of snow was blinding. A rider was making his way up the trail, his horse struggling through the deep drifts. It was Jedediah, a quiet homesteader from a lower hollow, a man whose fence Matthew had helped mend after the first big storm. Jedediah arrived breathless, his horse lathered in sweat, its breath pluming in the frigid air. He refused to dismount. "Matthew," he panted, his eyes wide with urgency. "Trouble's coming." Matthew stepped onto the porch, his hand resting on the axe he'd been using to split kindling. "What trouble?" "Jedediah. 2 men, down at the general store in Elk Crossing, asking for you. Asking for the Thorn place." He leaned down from his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They're not from around here. They got the look of the plains about them. And they've been drinking since sunup, bragging, saying they've come to collect a debt, a family matter." Ruthie appeared in the doorway behind Matthew, her face suddenly pale. She clutched the doorframe, a cold dread seeping into her heart. She knew. Before Jedediah even described them, she knew. "One is loud and barrel-chested," the man continued. "The other is leaner, with a mean, watchful look to him. They're riding hired horses. They said they're coming up now." "Caleb and Horace," Ruthie whispered, the names like stones in her mouth. "Her brothers." "Thank you, Jedediah," Matthew said, his voice a low, calm rumble that betrayed none of the sudden tension in his shoulders. "You've done a good turn. Get back to your family before the light fails." Jedediah nodded, wheeled his tired horse around, and began his descent, leaving a profound and heavy silence in his wake. Matthew turned and looked at Ruthie. He saw the terror in her eyes, the ghost of her old life rising up to haunt her. He stepped inside and slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. The sound a solid, definitive thud. He went to the wall where his Winchester rifle rested on 2 pegs. He took it down, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He checked the action, the metallic click loud in the quiet cabin. "Stay inside," he said. "Stay with the boy." The waiting was a torment. Every sigh of the wind in the pines, every creak of the cabin's logs settling under the weight of the snow, sounded like an approaching footstep. Ruthie sat in the rocking chair, Mercy bundled in her arms, her body a shield around her son. She prayed, not the desperate, pleading prayers of her past, but a fierce, silent prayer for the man who was now standing guard over their life. Matthew stood by the window, a dark, silent silhouette against the bright snow outside. He watched the trail. The sun began its slow descent, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pale rose and violet. The world was achingly beautiful and fraught with a terrible suspense. Then he saw them. Two dark figures on horseback, moving slowly. Their progress marked by the crunch of their horses' hooves on the frozen crust of the snow. The sound carried with an unnatural clarity in the still, cold air. It was the only sound in the world. Matthew moved from the window and went to the door. He did not unbar it. He simply waited. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, stopping just beyond the small porch. There was a moment of silence. Then the thump of boots hitting the snow. A voice, loud and thick with a whiskey-fueled belligerence, shattered the peace of the valley. It was Caleb. "Ruthie, we know you're in there. Your family has come for you. Open this door." Matthew remained silent, his hand resting on the rifle, its barrel pointed at the floor. "Don't make us break it down," Caleb roared. "We've come to take you home, to take you away from this animal who's keeping you." Another voice, colder and sharper, cut through the air. "Horace, the shame you've brought on us is a debt to be paid. Sister, the good deacon wants what is his. The child is his blood, and he wants it raised in a Christian house, not a savage's hut." Inside, Ruthie flinched as if struck. They had said it, the final, ugly truth she had carried. They were using it as a weapon, not just against her, but against Matthew. She looked at his back, at the rigid set of his shoulders. She saw his knuckles, white on the stock of the rifle. She made a decision. She would not hide behind this man and let him fight her battles. She had a voice now. She had a name. She was no longer the girl they had sent away. She stood up, her sleeping son held tight against her shoulder. "Matthew," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "unbar the door." He turned, his gray eyes searching her face. He saw not fear, but a strength he had never seen before, a hard, cold resolve. He gave a single sharp nod and lifted the heavy bar. He pulled the door open and stepped out onto the porch, into the freezing late afternoon air. Ruthie followed, stopping just behind him in the doorway. Her brothers stood in the snow, their faces flushed, their arrogance plain to see. Caleb was big and brutish, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol tucked into his belt. Horace was leaner. His eyes narrowed, a cruel smirk on his lips. They looked from Matthew's impassive, bearded face to the woman in the doorway. They saw the baby in her arms. "There she is," Caleb boomed, taking a step forward, hiding behind her mountain man. "Give us our sister. It's time to pay for the disgrace you brought upon our father's name." Matthew didn't move. He didn't raise the rifle. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable obstacle. It was Ruthie who spoke. Her voice was not the timid whisper they remembered. It was clear and carried in the cold air, as sharp as broken ice. "You are not welcome here," she said. Horace sneered. "This isn't your decision, little sister. This is about family honor, about Deacon Hiram's child." Ruthie took a step forward, emerging from the shadow of the doorway into the fading light. She held Mercy closer. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with a terrible clarity. "Let us speak of the deacon. Let us speak of his nightly visits to my room when my mother was ill. Let us speak of his prayers that felt like threats, and his hands that felt like cages. Let us speak of the honor of a family that saw my suffering, that heard my pleas, and that chose to send me away like unwanted cargo to hide their own righteous shame." Caleb and Horace were struck dumb. This was not the frightened, compliant sister they knew. This was a stranger, a woman who was turning their own accusations back on them like a sharpened blade. Caleb found his voice first, sputtering with rage. "Lies. You'll say anything to protect your sin." He started forward, his hand moving toward his pistol. Matthew moved. It was not a fast movement, but it was absolute. He shifted his weight, and the barrel of the Winchester came up, not to his shoulder, but to his hip, pointed not at Caleb's chest, but at the ground in front of him. It was not a threat to kill. It was a line drawn in the snow. His voice, when he spoke, was unnervingly quiet. It was lower than the wind, yet it seemed to shake the very air. It was a voice harder and colder than any steel. "My wife," he said. Each word was a heavy stone, dropped into the silence. He took a half step to the side, making it clear he was not blocking Ruthie, but standing beside her. "Her home," he said. He looked down for a fraction of a second at the sleeping infant in Ruthie's arms. Then his gaze, as hard and unforgiving as granite, locked onto Horace. "My son." The three words were a final, irrevocable claim. They were a vow, a judgment, and a sentence all in one. In that moment, he was not just Ruthie's husband. He was Mercy's father. He erased the deacon. He erased their shame. He erased her past with the simple, powerful truth of his chosen family. Caleb and Horace stood frozen, the drunken bravado draining out of them, replaced by the cold, sober reality of the man they were facing. They were merchants of shame and intimidation. They had no currency here. They had come to collect a debt from a broken girl and had found themselves facing a king in his castle. Horace recovered first, his mind always sharper, more venomous. "This isn't over," he hissed. "We'll be back. We'll bring the deacon. We'll bring the law. We'll see what the good people of this territory have to say about a harlot and her keeper raising a child of God in a den of sin." With that, they backed away, their retreat clumsy in the deep snow. They mounted their horses and turned, digging their heels in and sending clumps of snow flying. They rode away without looking back. As they disappeared down the trail, a light snow began to fall. Soft, feathery flakes that drifted down from the darkening sky. Within minutes, the angry, churned-up tracks of their horses began to soften, the sharp edges blurring, the trail of their intrusion slowly but surely being erased by the quiet, impartial grace of the mountain. Matthew stood on the porch, the rifle still held at his side, until they were long gone. Ruthie stepped up beside him, and he put his free arm around her and the child. They stood together, watching the snow fall. A new and untested family that had just won its first battle. But they both knew the war was not over. The threat had been clear. The fight was coming down from the mountain. It was heading for the town, for the church, for the cold, watchful eyes of the community. Their private truth would now have to stand trial in the public square. The threat did not remain a ghost on the mountain. Caleb and Horace were true to their word. They did not ride back up the trail with guns drawn. Their weapon was more insidious. They went to the town. They went to the church. They spread their poison, couched in the language of righteousness and family honor. And the small, isolated community of Elk Crossing, starved for drama and quick to judge, listened. The summons came not on the wind, but by the hand of Reverend Miller himself. He rode up the thawing trail 3 days after the confrontation, his face grave and his eyes filled with a weary sadness. He did not come as a friend, but as an arbiter, a man bound by his duty to his flock and his God. "There are accusations," he said, standing on the porch, refusing Matthew's offer to come inside. "Grievous ones. Your brothers-in-law have made a formal complaint. They claim the marriage is a fraud, performed under false pretenses. They claim the child is not yours, but the son of a deacon in their home state, and that you are keeping both mother and child against the family's will." "It is my family's will that they remain here," Matthew stated, his voice flat. "That is not how it is being told in town," the Reverend said gently. "This has become a public matter, a scandal that touches upon the sanctity of a holy union I myself performed. I cannot let it stand unresolved. I am calling a public meeting in the churchyard tomorrow at midday. Both parties will be given a chance to speak. The community will bear witness." He looked from Matthew's stony face to Ruthie, who had come to stand in the doorway, the baby asleep on her shoulder. "I am asking you, as your pastor, to be there." It was not a request. It was a command, a trial, not in a courthouse, but in the court of public opinion, where the sentences were shame and ostracization. The next day, they rode down the mountain in the buckboard. Mercy wrapped warmly and nestled in a basket at Ruthie's feet. The sky was the color of lead, and the air was so cold that every breath was a visible plume of white smoke. The entire town of Elk Crossing seemed to be gathered in the muddy yard in front of the small, unpainted log church. They formed a rough circle, their faces pinched and curious, their bodies huddled in thick coats against the cold. They were not a congregation. They were an audience, hungry for a spectacle. Reverend Miller stood on the top step of the church porch, his Bible in his hand. Caleb and Horace stood to his right, their faces masks of smug piety. Matthew helped Ruthie down from the wagon, and they walked to stand opposite them, creating a stark tableau, the righteous accusers and the silent, mountain outcasts. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a rustle of whispers and judgments. The Reverend raised a hand, and a tense silence fell. "We are gathered here not to cast stones," he began, his voice carrying in the frigid air, "but to seek truth. Accusations have been made that challenge a marriage made before God. Caleb and Horace Miller, you may speak." Caleb stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Reverend, folks," he began, his voice booming with practiced indignation. "We came all this way from Missouri out of love for our sister and respect for the laws of God and man. We found her held here by this trapper. He took advantage of her desperate situation. He entered into a fraudulent marriage to lay claim to a child that is not his, a child of Deacon Hiram Lowe, a pillar of our community. We are here to dissolve this mockery of a union and return our sister and the boy to a proper Christian home." The crowd murmured. The story was simple, believable. It painted Matthew as an opportunistic predator and Ruthie as a fallen woman who needed saving from her own sin. Reverend Miller looked at Matthew. "Matthew Thorne, what say you to this?" Matthew did not look at Caleb or Horace. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the Reverend, his gaze direct and unwavering. He did not raise his voice. He did not offer a defense. "I advertised for a wife," he said, his words clear and simple. Ruthie answered, "You married us. She is my wife. The child is my son. The choice was mine. I place no blame on anyone else for it." He had admitted nothing and confessed everything. He had claimed full responsibility for his actions, dismantling their accusation of trickery with the simple, solid fact of his own free will. The crowd grew quieter, intrigued by this man who refused to play the part of the villain. "And what of the child's true parentage?" the Reverend pressed gently. Before Matthew could answer, Ruthie stepped forward. She had handed Mercy to Matthew, and now she stood alone, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked small and fragile against the vast, cold landscape. But her voice, when she spoke, was strong. "My brothers speak of shame," she said, her eyes sweeping over the faces in the crowd, lingering for a moment on the scornful faces of Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Pritchard. "I know of shame. My family sent me here because of it. They did not send me here to be saved. They sent me away as a joke. They answered Mr. Thorne's advertisement, which was meant for my sister, and put me on the wagon in her place, because I was pregnant and ruined, and they wanted the problem to disappear." A new wave of murmurs went through the crowd, this one laced with a different tone, surprise, pity. "They speak of Deacon Lowe," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "They do not speak of how he was my father's most trusted friend, a man who came to our house to offer prayers and comfort when my mother was dying. They do not speak of how his comfort turned to something else in the darkness of a sick room, of how a young woman's grief was taken advantage of. They speak of a Christian home, but the home I was sent from chose to protect the reputation of a powerful man over the safety of its own daughter." She finished, her words hanging in the frozen air. She had not been hysterical or accusatory. She had simply told her truth, a story of quiet betrayal and calculated cruelty. In the crowd, several of the women who knew their own silent struggles and the quiet hypocrisies of men, lowered their gazes, looking down at their own hands, a gesture of shared, unspoken shame. Caleb's face was purple with rage. Lies slander against a man of God. Reverend Miller held up his hand again, his own face troubled. The clean, simple lines of the story had been irrevocably complicated. This was no longer a case of a trapper stealing another man's child. This was a story of deep wounds and conflicting truths. "This is a matter of one word against another," the Reverend declared, his voice heavy. "A final judgment cannot be made today. The truth of this lies between here and Missouri. I call for a time of prayer and investigation. We will await further testimony before this community renders its verdict." He looked at Caleb and Horace. "And we will await the arrival of this Deacon Hiram Lowe, if he chooses to come and speak for himself." It was a postponement, not an acquittal. As the crowd began to disperse, their whispers now a confused, conflicted buzz. A rider came struggling up the main street from the east. It was the mail carrier, his horse exhausted. He dismounted and handed a single letter to the Reverend. Reverend Miller broke the seal and read it, his expression growing graver with each line. He looked up, his eyes finding Matthew and Ruthie. "It seems we will not have to wait long," he said, his voice low. "This is from Deacon Lowe's own hand. He is on the trail. He passed through Fort Laramie last week. He is coming, he says, to claim his child." The news spread through the remaining crowd like a prairie fire. The final witness, the accuser himself, was on his way. The next 3 days were a new kind of hell. The cabin on the mountain was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress under siege, surrounded by an army of whispers and watching eyes. They were isolated, suspended in a state of terrible anticipation. Every night, they left the lantern burning in the window, a small, defiant flame against the immense darkness, a signal to the world and to each other that they would not be extinguished. They spoke little, but their silence was a bond. In a quiet moment, as Mercy slept, Matthew reached across the table and took Ruthie's hand. He simply held it, his thumb stroking her knuckles, a silent promise that whatever was coming, they would face it together. On the 3rd day, a cry went up from the town. A rider had been spotted on the eastern trail. He was here. Reverend Miller sent a boy up to the Thorn cabin. "He has arrived. He requests your presence at the church." Once more, they made the journey down the mountain. This time, the entire town was there. It was not a hearing, it was a spectacle. The crowd parted as Matthew and Ruthie walked toward the church steps, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim judgment. Standing on the porch beside Caleb and Horace was a man dressed in black broadcloth, his clothes fine but covered in the dust of a long journey. He was tall and imposing, with a stern, handsome face framed by silvering hair. This was Deacon Hiram Lowe. He looked every inch the powerful, righteous man his reputation suggested. Caleb smirked, a look of triumph on his face. The final judge had arrived. Reverend Miller stepped forward. "Deacon Lowe, you have come a long way. We are here to hear your testimony." The deacon's eyes scanned the crowd, finally landing on Ruthie. She stood with Matthew, her head held high, refusing to cower. His stern expression wavered. Something in her quiet dignity, in the unyielding presence of the man beside her, seemed to break him. The mask of authority crumbled. His shoulders, which had been so straight, slumped. His face, which had been so severe, seemed to collapse inward. He took a shuffling step forward, then another. He did not look at the Reverend or at Ruthie's brothers. He looked only at the woman he had wronged. He reached the bottom of the steps, stumbled, and fell to his knees in the cold, muddy slush of the churchyard, his fine black coat soaking up the grime. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not the arrogant accuser they had expected. This was a broken man. He lifted his head, and his face was a wreck of anguish and shame. Tears streamed openly down his cheeks, cutting clean paths through the trail dust. When he spoke, his voice was not the powerful baritone of a preacher, but the choked, ragged sob of a condemned soul. "I am the one who sinned," he cried out, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. Every word she spoke is true. I was a wolf in the shepherd's fold. I used her grief as a key and God's name as a cloak. He looked around at the shocked faces, his gaze finally settling on Caleb and Horace, who stared at him in horror. "And I did nothing," he confessed, the words tearing from his throat, "when her family cast her out to save my reputation." I stood by in silence. I let her bear my shame alone. I let her walk into the wilderness to carry the cross that was mine to bear. The murmuring of the crowd, the whispers of judgment, the rustle of suspicion, it all ceased. The only sound in the churchyard was the weeping of a guilty man and the cold sigh of the wind. The trial was over, but a new question, stark and silent, now hung in the air, directed not at the woman on the porch, but at every soul in that circle, who, now, was in need of mercy. The silence that followed the deacon's confession was a physical thing, a vacuum that sucked the air from the churchyard. For a long, frozen moment, the only sound was the man's ragged sobbing in the mud. The crowd stood transfixed, a gallery of shocked and shamed faces. They had come for a spectacle of sin and judgment and had been delivered a raw, undeniable lesson in it. But the sinner was not the one they had expected. It was Reverend Miller who broke the spell. He descended the church steps, his face a mask of profound sorrow and humility. He did not go to the weeping deacon. He walked directly to Matthew and Ruthie. He stopped before them, and in front of the entire town, he bowed his head. "Forgive me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that went beyond pastoral duty. It was the sound of a man confronting his own fallibility. "I allowed my churchyard to be used as a stage for slander. I was hasty to judge, and slow to see the truth that was right before me. The Lord teaches that mercy triumphs over judgment, and I forgot the lesson." He looked up, his eyes meeting Matthew's, then Ruthie's. "The marriage I performed in that cabin, in the heart of the storm, I thought it was an act of necessity, a practical measure. I see now that it was something more. It was an act of profound faith, perhaps the most Christian act I have ever been privileged to witness." He turned to face the stunned and silent crowd. "Let this be a lesson to all of us in Elk Crossing. We are a community bound not by the perfection of our souls, but by our shared need for grace. The house of God is not a courthouse. It is a hospital for the broken." He looked back at the couple. "Your vows were made in private, witnessed only by God and myself. I think they deserve to be spoken again, here, in the light of this hard-won truth, before all of us as witnesses to the strength of your union." He was offering them not a trial, but a coronation. And so, in the cold, muddy churchyard, a second wedding took place. It was as simple and as stark as the first. There were still no rings, but the vows, when they spoke them this time, were different. They were not the hopeful promises of strangers, but the reaffirmed oaths of partners who had walked through the fire and emerged, together, on the other side. When Matthew took Ruthie's hand, his grip was not just gentle, it was reverent, and when he spoke the words, to love, to cherish, and to protect, his voice was a low, unbreakable promise, a vow made not just to her, but to the entire world. When Ruthie spoke her vows, her voice did not tremble. It was clear and steady, the voice of a woman who knew her own worth and the value of the man who stood beside her. They were no longer two separate souls making a bargain. They were a family, forged and tempered. As the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, again, a strange and beautiful thing happened. From the back of the crowd, a woman stepped forward. It was Mrs. Pritchard, one of the gossips from the general store. In her hands, she carried a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She walked up to Ruthie, her face a mixture of shame and a hard-won sincerity. She did not speak. She simply held out the bundle. It was a still warm loaf of sourdough bread. Ruthie took it, her eyes meeting the other woman's, and in that shared glance, an apology was offered and an absolution was granted. Then another woman came forward, Mrs. Gable, her face equally chagrined. She carried a small, folded quilt, its colors bright against the gray day. Then another and another. They came with jars of preserves, with knitted stockings, with small, humble gifts from their own sparse larders. They were offerings of peace, the silent, heartfelt penance of a community seeking to heal itself. The women who had once whispered in judgment now pressed her hand, their touch a silent pledge of solidarity. Through it all, Caleb and Horace stood frozen, forgotten. The ground had crumbled beneath their feet. Their self-righteous crusade had ended in their own public humiliation. The crowd no longer looked at them with curiosity, but with a cold, quiet contempt. They were the authors of this shame, and now they were drowning in it. Without a word, they turned, their movements stiff and awkward. They pushed their way through the crowd, which parted for them with a pointed silence. They mounted their horses and rode away, two small, bitter figures shrinking against the vast, indifferent landscape. Their power was broken, their lies exposed. They were never seen in the Bitterroot Valley again. Deacon Hiram Lowe remained on his knees, a weeping, broken man, until Jedediah and another homesteader quietly helped him to his feet and led him away, offering him the same mercy he had for so long denied another. The winter finally gave way to a true, gentle spring. The valley floor turned green, and the high meadows exploded with wildflowers. In the hollow where their cabin stood, Matthew began to build. He felled the straightest, strongest pines, and, with the help of Jedediah and other men from the town who now called him a friend, he raised a small, simple structure on a piece of land just down from their home. It was not a house. It was a chapel, a single room with a steeple that pointed to the sky. He had traded a season's worth of prime beaver pelts for it, a small, cast bronze bell. He hung it himself in the steeple, and over the door, he carved two words into a lintel of smooth, polished pine, Mercy Hollow. Their cabin, and now the chapel, became a beacon. Their life was a testament. Ruthie, who had once been defined by shame, was now defined by grace. On Sundays, she would teach the handful of children from the surrounding homesteads their letters and numbers in the chapel. Her favorite lesson was a single verse she would have them trace with their fingers: mercy triumphs over judgment. Her quiet, gentle spirit became the moral compass for the small, growing community. The sound of children's laughter began to echo in the hollow, a sound as sweet and as nourishing as the smell of her constantly baking bread. The light in their window, which had once been a signal of survival, became a signal of sanctuary. Travelers caught in early snows, prospectors down on their luck, lost souls wandering the vast wilderness, they all learned that in Mercy Hollow there was a cabin where a lamp always burned. They knew they could find a warm fire, a bowl of hot stew, and a moment of quiet, non-judgmental peace, offered freely by the big, quiet mountain man and his gentle, smiling wife. The seasons turned. The first snow of the next winter began to fall, not with the violence of a storm, but in a soft, peaceful benediction. The world was once again turning quiet and white. From the porch of their cabin, Ruthie stood. Her son, now a strong, healthy toddler, balanced on her hip. Matthew came and stood beside her, his arms circling her shoulders, pulling her and their son into the solid warmth of his body. From the steeple of the small chapel down the hill, the sound of the bell began to ring. Matthew had rigged a rope so he could ring it from the cabin on evenings like this. It was not a call to worship, but a call to remember. The clear, resonant notes drifted out over the snow-covered valley, a sound of profound and tranquil beauty. Ruthie leaned her head against Matthew's shoulder, watching the snow fall, her heart full. Mercy, a cruel joke, born of wickedness and shame, had been transformed, through a single act of defiant kindness, into a home. A bitter exile had become a blessed sanctuary, and whatever storms the future might bring, whatever hardships the long winters might hold, The bell would continue to ring, reminding the silent, watching mountains, and all who took shelter in their shadow, that here, in this small, grace-filled hollow, was a place called home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and consider hitting that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.